네,
Thank you.
안녕하세요. 인사드립니다.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and
더불어민주당의
gentlemen.
김영배입니다.
My name is Young-bae Kim of the Democratic Party. As was just introduced, I am the Vice President of the floor, also, and was elected to the National Assembly during the recent election. Actually, with John, I had a meeting at his school a couple of years ago. I hope John remembers that meeting. It's once again a great pleasure to see you again, even though through online. Globally, COVID-19 has become indeed a totally new challenge and crisis. Also, it's been an opportunity for everyone to become more enlightened of the way we had lived, of things that we had thought was a development and progress. Actually, in hindsight, is coming into serious question. So it's a period for us to do a lot of rethinking. As you know, Korea went through this period of being a developing country and has been focused on growth in size and scale rather than quality, and have been seeing nature as more of a means for further development. It is a typical country that's gone through that growth economic model. However, recently, through COVID-19, Korea has had a chance, has been forced to look back into what we had done in the past to develop and to grow. I think with COVID-19, Korean society has been able to highlight on some key topics. A few of them being, first of all, the fact that Korea had been focused on e-government, and we had a very good digital infrastructure throughout the public and private sector. And that had helped actually the government to actually gain consensus from the public. I think that was a critical momentum as the government sought to gain the support of the public regarding various activities it had to engage in, especially as everything closed down and people had to remain non-face-to-face. There were inevitable situations where digital infrastructure and digital society had to be used in order to overcome challenges. And I think that is actually a question that we need to solve through going forward. One question coming out of that being allowing the government the means to control the situation of tracking and treating this infectious disease. Basic disease control functionality and capabilities of the government, that is. So this would bring into question not only the medical resources of the central government, but also each local government, also the public medical resources and the private medical resources. All of that has been brought into a single pool. The second question branching out of it is containing the disease from spreading in order to prevent this from being a national pandemic. And when we are talking about regional outbreaks, regional clusters, that would have to be actually taken, led, or that initiative would have to be led by the local government and the local people, rather than the central government initiative. And even though Korea has had many historic moments where citizens had to step up, I think Koreans have been able to actually recall their resources and say, for example, they have to be considerate of others. And that's the main reason why they are wearing masks. There was a recent survey, and more than 80-90% of the people said that the reason they were wearing masks were to be considerate of others, to protect others from catching disease rather than to protect themselves. Also, we didn't have this hoarding and shortages, empty shelves. I think we were able to avoid a lot of the confusion that other societies went through because the citizens had that resource that they could resort to as they faced another crisis. So once again, I think looking back into the Korean experience, it was the central government, the local government, but also the citizens that have played a very important role in creating what is now being referred to as the Korean practice. One last comment that I want to mention is about the political background to this. As you know, Korea went through a major transition several years ago through the candlelight demonstration, which changed government. Also, the Constitutional Court played its role, and we were able to actually go through a new presidential election and have that transition quite effectively done. And I think that was an opportunity for Koreans to develop a very unique political culture where citizens play the leading role. I think that also showed as we went through the COVID crisis. And so once again, my impression is that democracy is not only important in keeping the society running, but also overcoming a crisis, as we saw during the past several months here in Korea. Thank you very much.
Mr. Kim, thank you. That was an extremely useful introduction and a reminder that the question of COVID-19 extends beyond the immediate health issues to these broader questions of politics, which I'm sure we'll want to come back to in our discussion. But let me move swiftly on to Jung-in Cho to hear his initial thoughts.
Thank you very much. I am Cho Jung-hoon, MP of a Transition Korea Party. It's a great honor for me to have a chance to participate in today's webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to extend my appreciation to Yoshide and the Chatham House. We are in the midst of dealing with a new pandemic called COVID-19, and it's too early for us to think about the victory over this new pandemic. But still, it's been 6 months since we get started with fighting against COVID-19, and it seems that there are some countries that are on the process of winning the fight. And I think this is the right time for us to look back on what we have done in the past and make evaluations of our past attempts to fight against the COVID-19. If we take a look at the result of the general election of Korea, it seems that the Korean general public is recognizing the merits of big government, particularly in terms of fighting against the epidemics. If you take a look back on the Korean history, the dynasty that succeeded in fighting against epidemics prospered, but those that failed to do so actually perished. And I believe that fighting against this pandemic is the kind of role that this big government should do. And also, while doing so, the Korean government should do its utmost to preserve and secure the maximum privacy and freedom of individuals. The COVID-19 pandemic is a global issue, and also it seems that the voice, which is for a small government, is losing its ground. And it seems that this is the right time for us to think about what should be the idealistic form of government to fight against the national emergency situation, such as COVID-19. This is a kind of task not only ahead of individual countries, but it's ahead of the international community. In this context, Korea is being highlighted or receiving spotlight in terms of its response to COVID-19. And I am often asked to share the Korean government's experiences in fighting against COVID-19. I'm not saying that Korea did well or did perfect. However, it's meaningful for us to look back on what's been done right in responding to COVID-19 here in Korea. So let me summarize the Korean government's response to the COVID-19. There are a few characteristics. The first one is resilience, which is capability to rebound from damage. we have a Korea Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And at the onset of COVID-19, the head of the KCDC came to the public and made this announcement. And she said that the COVID-19 is unprecedented pandemic. And it seems that no one is prepared for that, even though the Korean government and the KCDC has made needed preparations for potential epidemics. However, we are not sure whether we can tackle this COVID-19 pandemic properly or not, but we'll make a needed adjustment over the course of overcoming the epidemic. That's what she said at the onset of the COVID-19. Korea didn't have any available standard manual to use to fight against pandemics such as COVID-19. Korea is not a spontaneous country either. So it seems that the country has a certain level of manuals, but still it is accustomed to a spontaneous response to certain cases. So it was kind of mixture of spontaneous response and the standard manual. If I take a look back on the Korean government's response to the COVID-19, it seems that there was a kind of perfect mixture of spontaneous response and the utilization of a standard manual. Now, I believe that if that is possible, then an individual country can have an efficient and effective response to a pandemic such as COVID-19. And second characteristic is openness of the government's response to the pandemic. It is still vivid how the former government responded to pandemic or epidemics such as MERS or SARS. The former government actually made a lot of efforts to hide the relevant information about such pandemic. Unlike the previous government, the current government of Korea is quite transparent and open in sharing the epidemic or the pandemic-related information. Over the course of open and transparent sharing of information, there was a certain confusion in the general public. However, this openness contributed to the improvement of the situation, and also it led to the general public's trust of the government. As Mr. Kim or the MP Kim rightly pointed out, it laid foundation for collaboration between the government and the private sector, including the general public and citizens. And the third characteristic is comprehensiveness of information. COVID-19 is not limited to a specific reason or a specific class. So without having an entire society level quarantine system, it will be impossible for us to win the war against COVID-19. So the comprehensiveness of the quarantine system is a very critical part in responding to the COVID-19. So it seems that we do not have any difficulty in covering 90 to 95% of the general public in responding to the pandemic, but the remaining 10 or 5% is quite problematic. So this is a kind of last mile issue. But the Korean government has been very persistent and consistent in covering the last mile, which means covering the remaining 5% or 10% of the people. So the resilience, openness, and comprehensiveness are three main characteristics of the Korean government's response to COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to have another chance to have details later. Thank you.
Jung-hoon, thank you very much. Those three ideas of resilience, openness, and comprehensiveness, I think, neatly highlight the extraordinary success of South Korea. Let me move, if I can, to Andrew Lansley now. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, and greetings to our Korean friends and colleagues. Greetings from the UK Parliament to the National Assembly. And John was kind enough in the introduction to refer to the fact that I was for many years my Conservative Party's spokesman on health and Secretary of State for 2.5 years. That is particularly relevant to this discussion because, of course, it was in 2011 when I was Secretary of State that we prepared and published a pandemic influenza plan. That was essentially, for subsequent years, the basis for pandemic planning. Even, I think, when one moved to 2020. And I think that if I want to characterise the nature of the difficult issues with which the United Kingdom government has worked, I think the first was that as decisions are often made by seeking to approximate uncertainty to previous experience. So the British government started with a pandemic plan based on influenza, and in the uncertainties associated with the COVID-19 virus, failed to recognise that the differences were considerably more important than the similarities. So, for example, in this uncertainty, and one has to remember how uncertain we were about the nature of the virus back in the early part of this year. They didn't realise that it had, for some time, they didn't realise the length of the incubation period, significant, much longer than flu. They didn't realise the extent to which those who were asymptomatic could carry the virus for some considerable time. And they didn't recognise the symptoms. So there were symptoms like the loss of smell and taste, which I think it took probably until April before it was established that this was symptomatic of the presence of the virus. So as my successor, the Secretary of State for Health now, has said, they were operating in what's known as the fog of uncertainty. Now, under those circumstances, of course, they said and rightly so, that they would be guided by the scientific advice. And let me give you an example, as laid on in these terms as the 9th of March. Ministers said that not only were they guided by the science, but that the scientific advice is clear, quoting, "Acting too early creates its own risks." This was clearly not true. Acting early would have been a significant and decisive factor in controlling the spread of the virus, because the extent of community transmission in the United Kingdom was clearly considerably more than they understood at the time, partly for the reasons about the nature of the virus that I was just talking about. And I think what that tells us is that there are a number of issues. First is the nature of scientific advice and the nature of the evidence on which that advice is based. And sometimes you cannot wait for the evidence that would pass normal scientific tests, that it is better to operate on empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence should have told us quite early on that countries such as Korea, whose approach, if I may suggest, was perhaps more directed towards the threat of a coronavirus like SARS or MERS, not just to the threat of an influenza virus, and the responses that Korea demonstrated actually served to suppress the virus more effectively, and we should have recognised that at an early stage. This is a continuing issue. Yesterday evening, the British government took the decision to make face masks mandatory in shops. Now, I know that the advice from UK scientists, and indeed the World Health Organization until quite early in the part of this year, was that face masks would not have a significant impact on the spread of the virus. And the consequence of that is that because that advice has changed, they have arrived at the point where face masks are going to be used, but through a long process of discussion. Frankly, empirical evidence in other countries should have told them at a much earlier stage that this was a necessary step to take. So my issues of, number one, we have to be clear about the kind of scientific evidence we use. Secondly, although I won't elaborate on it, I think it was evident that while central decision-making is necessary, decentralised delivery is equally necessary. The scale of the problems that the British government faced required a decentralised executive response, and too often the executive response was held into central hands rather than distributed. And the third point I'd make for our discussion is, I think the British government, the evidence is very clear that they thought that if they attempted to lock down the country too early, at a point at which there was not significant public understanding of the threat and the extent of the spread of the illness, the public wouldn't accept it. I'm afraid the evidence, I think, is accumulating that actually the public would have accepted. But behavioural responses under these circumstances can be, if anything, ahead of the government, whereas the government thought that they were leading the behavioural response rather than responding to it. So these, I think, are three issues. How far we centralise control, how far we trust people, we are open with them and we trust them, and how far we actually use empiricism as a basis for evidential test of what responses should be. Thank you, John.
Andrew, that's really excellent. Thank you. And I see we're already having questions that pick up on some of the points that you were very helpfully introducing, so we'll come back to those again. Baroness Brinton, if you'd like to wrap up with your 5 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A.
I think one of the biggest things that we all have to do is to learn from each other. And my themes are global, national, and local. And I think that certainly Europe and America did not learn fast enough from the progression of coronavirus in Asia and the way that many countries, including South Korea, handled it. And I know particularly because I work closely with our sister party in Taiwan, who are in government, about their practices. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the South Korean experience. The first thing that we noticed, I think, was transmission, where we were hooked, certainly in the United Kingdom, on only stopping transmission from Wuhan and not realizing that transmission was happening much faster. In my local area in mid-February, we had more cases from Italy than we did from China. And the UK was very slow to recognize that. The other big theme globally, which I think the World Health Organization would certainly support, is that we should have pooled ideas and resources earlier to look at medicines and vaccines, medicines to treat and vaccines for obvious reasons to hopefully provide a vaccine within record time. And I think the aspiration at the start, back early in January, February, was admirable. But as progression of COVID in countries has moved on, I'm afraid too many countries have become very insular, and that has not been good for the future of the world. And the third global point I want to make is about the role of the World Health Organization, which is made up of member states, and yet the member states are treating it as if it isn't, as if it is a body with its own authority other than that of the member states. And I fear that the political fallout of that means that we will need to review that, but we must have a World Health Organization in some form. I want to pick up on the point, moving to the United Kingdom, that Andrew made about culture. And we certainly were too slow in responding to the needs because of concern about what citizens wanted. And I think my general point from the luxurious position of being an opposition spokesperson is that the government was too cautious and remains too cautious in making decisions. And I want to pick up on the points that both our Korean colleagues have made, that actually you need clear, transparent communication and strong decisions that guide citizens in everything they do. And almost every decision that's been made has been 2 to 3 weeks behind our European counterparts. We've got to have some analogy, and I take them because I would suspect our cultures are broadly the same. And I think the other problem that we face in the United Kingdom is both a blessing and a curse, and that is the NHS. I pay credit to Andrew when he was our Secretary of State for Health for trying to separate out public health from healing people and moving certainly our directors of public health to work locally as they already do. The problem is with the NHS that it is something of a silo. It is a place that takes a very long time to come to decisions. And when decisions needed to make at a very local level, it's taken far too long for that to happen. The blessing, and I wouldn't take anything away from this, is that with a nationalized health system, we have been able to see what has been happening and to direct resources into hospitals. And that has been a help. But the consequence of that is that our elderly care has been left, unfortunately, unprotected for some considerable time, although I do hope the government will remedy that in the face of some way. Finally, the vexed issue about how we use our digital society to move us forward. And one of the big frustrations for myself and my colleagues in the United Kingdom has been the reliance on a digital app rather than the old tried and tested ways of test and trace to immediately control a small local cluster or a regional cluster, or indeed to manage a second wave. And that brings me full circle to where I started, which is to say, we have watched in South Korea the way in which you have handled that. And I do hope that we have learned the lessons that we can take forward. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Let me just kick off with just a few brief questions, because we are already accumulating quite a lot of questions from the audience. And start with Yongbei, if I may. You talked, I think, very importantly about the issue of local central coordination and Andrew's point about how best to ensure that coordination. I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about how you saw that process working, and were there important models of previous forms of local central coordination that informed the policymaking process in South Korea when it came to responding to COVID-19?
예, 우선은 그 말씀을 드리기 전에
Well, before I answer that question,
우리 고민의 핵심은 비대면 사회를
I think
요구하고
the
있는 이 팬데믹 상황에서
essence of the situation is that this pandemic is calling for a non-face-to-face society.
사람이 안 만나고 살 수는 없기 때문에
And people do need to meet. We cannot live without meeting.
만남의 조건을
But
확보할 수
we need
있는가가
to
앞으로도 핵심이라고
allow these
보고요.
meetings and
그런 점에서
interactions to happen
보면
under safe conditions.
중앙정부가
And in that context,
인프라를 잘 깔고
the central government's role and responsibility will be to provide the right infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, as well as the health, including universal health care and the facilities to provide the right medical care. That would be the critical role for the central government to play.
이제 전략적으로 보자면 한국에서
Now,
주로 사용했던
strategically,
전략이지만
what Korea has done was more of a surgical approach. Surgical meaning we would pinpoint the key epicenters of the situation and surgically identify and surgically track these hotspots. And the government would need to increase and hone that capability going forward as well. The third is to communicate the central government's message clearly, to not only get the public's adherence and following to the government policy, but also to get their active support. So when it comes to a national level disease control, I think the central government's role was around 70%, if I had to give a number. And then there were the KCDC that sort of played the role of coordinating with each of the local governments. I think it's important that the communication with the citizens happened in an open forum. it wasn't just communication in documents, but we had actual live broadcast of communication and briefings on a regular basis. We also used the media quite actively. And so we had a very rich communication going on from both the central and local government to the citizens. And I think building that trust between the authorities and the citizens was a much more important role.
Do you have a sense, when we think about the contrast between the UK and South Korea, obviously South Korea with a presidential system with a lot of political authority concentrated in the hands of the Blue House, is that relevant in terms of thinking about the different responses of the UK and under its parliamentary system and a system like South Korea? Of course, we have in the case of the United States a presidential system which has been shown to be woefully inadequate in responding to the current crisis, and personalities, one imagines, play a big part in that. But are there any insights that we can gain from the nature of the political structure in South Korea that might be relevant here?
개인적인 의견입니다.
Please understand that this is my personal opinion.
한국이 두 가지인데요. 코로나19를
While responding to this COVID-19 pandemic, Korea has been relatively successful.
첫 번째는
There are two reasons,
국제적으로
in my personal opinion. Firstly,
바이러스가 처음 시작됐을 때
the COVID-19 started in Wuhan, China, and
중국에 바로 근접한 대한민국은
Korea is located very closely to China. So we had a high level of crisis at the time, at the onset of COVID-19. So there was a high level of sense of emergency in the general public. And also there was a social consensus on drastic measures taken by the Korean government. And the Korean government actually took that drastic measure with a high level of a sense of crisis. There was no disagreement about the crisis situation. So we had a kind of real-time monitoring of the Wuhan's situation, particularly the COVID-19 related situation. So thankfully, we had a social consensus on the crisis caused by the COVID-19. And there was a general election in Korea back in April 15th. And the general election was characterized as the evaluation of the current government with regard to its efforts to fight against COVID-19. And the ruling party did its utmost to win the general public's agreement about the way the Korean government responded to the COVID-19. So there was a kind of perfect synchronization between the government's efforts and the general public's consensus. And also the presidential office centralized response was very effective in fighting against COVID-19. So to summarize, Korea is located very closely to China, and it led to the elevated level of sense of crisis, which helped us to make a needed response. When this COVID-19 occurred in Wuhan, China, there also was certain criticism from the general public over the response of the Korean government. However, the criticism dwindled when the general public of Korea took a look at how other European countries such as Italy and Spain responded to COVID-19, and Korean people realized that the Korean government did well compared to other European countries or other countries around the world. And that is the point where the general public or the general Koreans actually resonated with the Korean government and its attempts to fight against COVID-19. So there was a chance for the general public of Korea to make comparison between the Korean government's response to COVID-19 and other countries' response to the COVID-19. And it was a kind of chance for us to realize that the Korea is doing good. And also a strong centralized attempt to fight against COVID-19 led by the Korean government worked well. But paradoxically, in a situation, the emergency situation like this, this strong command and control system centering around the president worked very well and found to be very effective. So this COVID-19 would not be the last pandemic that the entire humankind will face. So based on our experiences in fighting against COVID-19, we need to summarize the lessons we learned from the course, and this is a kind of task ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can now direct a question to our two UK colleagues. John Dunn, Cambridge, asks, the experience of Korea seems to demonstrate the success of, or the resilience of democracy in South Korea. And Professor Dunn would like to know what the current crisis says about the state of democratic governance in the UK. Andrew, I'm thinking particularly of your comments about behavioural assessments. Number 10 has, of course, its nudge unit, and has a lot of political commentary has been made about the importance of this unit, but it seems to have got it quite wrong, judging from your observations. Why is that, do you think?
Well, the simple answer, John, in that respect is because the nudge behavioural approaches that have been tested and used in policy making in recent years have done so not in a crisis context, not as an emergency. I mean, actually, one should be looking back to the kind of mass observations undertaken during the Second World War in order to begin to understand how populations respond in a crisis. And that is the kind of measure we should be looking for. And truth to tell, it probably wasn't until late March that the British government was treating this as a crisis in the way that I think Representative Cho was suggesting, that at an early stage, the government of the Republic of Korea was treating this as a crisis at a much earlier stage. And though that difference is, I think, absolutely critical. Now, that doesn't mean we can't now learn. We have to learn, and the behavioural responses now, I'm sure, will be different. And I hope the government will recognise that for the time being, we've got a population who are, if anything, more anxious than the government is, and therefore more keen to protect others and their families than the government perhaps had given them credit for. So let's use that for the time being. But it is going to be, as we are all fond of saying, this is a marathon and not a sprint. And understanding how public opinion is shifting over time will be incredibly important for the government to do. So something equivalent to mass observation, that is large-scale testing of the public's responses to the crisis and the continuing necessity of restraint. Because let's face it, we're not. If we're going to protect vulnerable people and not have to have a further set of outbreaks, we're going to have to retain substantial restrictions on normal life for months yet, many months yet, potentially. And the public are going to have to adapt to that new normal, and understanding how they are adapting to it, I think, is going to be very important. Because too much at the moment in this country is being expressed in terms of getting back to the old normal, rather than creating a new normal.
As Yongbei was saying, I think the question of the degree of trust between the electorate and the government was hugely important, and we have the example of the candlelit demonstrations. Baroness Brinton, from your Liberal Democratic perspective, are we too much of a fractured society? Has trust broken down between the electorate and government? Is that part of the problem in this instance, or are we in danger of exaggerating that?
I think it's a danger of being exaggerated. You know, I say this as somebody, as an opposition politician, who would be only too delighted to say, you know, we are totally fractured and it's all the government's fault. That is not the case. And I think the one point that hasn't been raised about the United Kingdom so far is that the Parliament gave the government almost presidential powers through the Coronavirus Act, so that they were able to take actions, and indeed still can. And Parliament receives changes to regulations about 3 weeks after they've been enacted. So Parliament can comment, but there isn't the blockage of the usual democracy structure. And So for parliamentarians of all parties, it's been a very fast learning experience of how we actually manage that democratically. But there's definitely been a feeling that the style of government and the powers of government have changed that dialogue. So the daily press conferences with the people have been an important element of that. And I think if you look at all the opinion polls, really up until about a month ago, regardless of whether people would have voted for this government, they were broadly supportive of what the government was doing, because, of course, as with many governments, the government was trying to keep them safe. So I think it's too easy to say everyone is divided. When you get down to some of the detail about mask wearing, not mask wearing, should we have lifted lockdown when we did, the economy versus health, then yes, those divides are very, very evident. And I think those structural things are there. But the fundamental issue about keeping people safe now and in the future, I think hasn't changed as far as the British people are concerned. There will, of course, be people who resent and any sort of restriction at all, but I think every society has those.
Thank you. Representative Kim, Virginia Rigoni would like to ask if you can say a little bit more about the spontaneous response that you described, and specifically which part of that spontaneous response was most successful, and did that involve the private sector, and in what capacity? How was the private sector able to partner with government in responding to the challenge of COVID-19?
About the private sector, I think their critical contribution was, first of all, the volunteers. Especially as you know, there was a very fast spread within the southeast part of Korea early on, with a population of around 4 million. It was a very rapid spread of COVID in that very concentrated part of Korea, which meant that local medical resource was so overburdened that it was almost to collapse. And watching that situation, our medical professionals and volunteers from all around the country, actually, despite all of the risk and danger, actually ran towards that area to go and support. There were volunteers, the people supported these volunteers, and I think that actually created a lot of emotional onboarding for the entire people, and got everyone motivated to overcome the situation together as a nation. There were moments during the crisis where the national government or the local government resources were overloaded, and I think those situations, those gaps were filled immediately by citizens running to help out. I think that once again was an experience of us showing our consolidation and alliance to overcome a challenge that we were commonly facing. It was once again a wonderful demonstration of our citizenship. And actually, it ended up making the situation better and people becoming more motivated and united at the end of that crisis, of course. So that's, I think, one episode that I remember in terms of the crisis and the private sector and their contributions. And I think that has been a lesson that we have acquired, that we will be able to revisit and rely upon again as we go and face other situations. Because I think the citizens actually felt a very strong sense of pride that they can actually make a difference, and that will become valuable even in the future. I think the second point that I want to mention is that each local government, as you know, Korea has a relatively short history of local government, but each local government came up with very creative, out-of-the-box ways of preventing disease control. For example, we had a dry drive-through testing facility created, and that idea came from a local government. We also created a care center. So for those patients who were infected and tested positive but didn't have very serious function or serious symptoms, those were actually put into these housing facilities so that the actual hospital beds could be reserved for more serious patients. And that idea also came from a local government, and then it was shared with other local governments in Korea. So these were, I think, examples of the local government taking the initiative and thinking out of the box. I think if there's a challenge, what's important is that everyone, whether it's a central government, local government, or citizens, feel that they are in charge. They feel the sense of responsibility and somehow try to find a better solution, regardless of who is in charge or not, and who is in taking the initiative or not. No matter how well our digital network is made out and how much resources and money we have, the implementation happens in the field by people. And the people need to be given the motivation to take charge and also to find that solution in the field. I think that was also a critical difference.
Thank you. Representative Cho, can I come back to this question of trust? Prashant Rao asked the question about the balance between openness and rights to privacy when it comes to contact tracing. And also David Fitton highlights the digital dimension of the South Korean response, and specifically would like to know how the older generation has responded. Because of course South Korea has, in terms of its demographic profile, a very large elderly population, which of course, as we know all too well, is particularly at risk to COVID-19, which makes, of course, the South Korean experience all the more dramatic in terms of managing the crisis. But in terms of the technology and trust, both in general and in terms of the older population, what has given them the confidence that track and trace is not only necessary, but also won't compromise some of these important privacy rights?
Thank you, John. 중요한 질문을 하셨습니다.
Thank you very much. It's a very critical and important question to deal with, I guess.
잠시만요, 제가 좀 바꾸고요.
Wait a minute. Let me change the channel. So this is a very critical question. Let me take an example of my parents. They are in their 80s.
온라인 쇼핑을 처음으로 시작하셨습니다.
So they started, they just started the online shopping in the midst of COVID-19, and they also successfully overcame the hurdle of payment, online payments. So these days they do not go to physical stores, rather they enjoy online shopping, making a payment easily online. So of course they are aware of the online shopping, but they didn't actually use it before this COVID-19 situation. And if you take a look at the fatality of the elderly people, it's over 10%. So it was a kind of time for them to get accustomed to online shopping to protect themselves. So with the help of the daughters-in-law and sons-in-law, they succeeded in mastering this online shopping skills. So this is one demonstration of a fast shift into the digital economy and digital platform. As you've rightly pointed out, the elderly people were isolated in this digitization process. But with, in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, these elderly people had a chance to get accustomed to this digital economy or digital platform, including online shopping. As you know, Korea is family-oriented society, so the members of the family are willing to help the elderly people so they can master some digital skills, including the online shopping skills. So it seems that the elderly citizens are also accommodated into the digital economy and digital platform at a relatively fast speed. But still, webinar is a kind of big hurdle ahead of them, and they are not quite accustomed to a kind of digital technology such as a webinar.
경제적, 사회적 소외감을 줄일 수 있는
So this is time for us to think about how we can deal with those vulnerable people who are disadvantaged, I mean, not only socially, but also economically. And also there is another task ahead of us, which is the balance between openness of information and the privacy. So it seems that there is a possibility that the nationwide, the blood serum test might be required. So from the national health perspective, this kind of the blood serum test for the entire population is required, but it can actually damage the privacy of people as well. So we need to keep the balance between the government role, particularly in terms of big government, and individuals' privacy. And there is no one-size-fits-all measures. So each country should consider its own situation and the circumstances. So there is no one global standard which can be applied to all countries around the world. So Korea is a kind of nationalistic society or the government-centered society, and now it is shifting to kind of the individual-centered society, putting more focus on the privacy of individuals. So it's a kind of still a big task ahead of us. Fortunately, the Korean KCDC has done a good job in protecting privacy while using the private information or the individual's information for quarantine purposes. So led by the KCDC, the all Korean the national institutions and the government has done its job in a pretty good way to protect the privacy of the individuals. As Baroness Brinton rightly pointed out, there is role to be played by the WHO at the global level, not only in terms of disease control or prevention, but also in terms of coming up with the guidelines for collection and the utilization of private data over the course of fighting the pandemic like COVID-19. And also, I'd like to ask a question to my colleague MPs. What would be the point where we can declare that we can put an end to, or we put an end to the COVID-19? What could be the criteria that we can use? It seems that no country is able to declare that the corona is ended. I mean, COVID-19 is ended. So I'd like to ask, what should be the criteria for us to apply to declare the end of our war against COVID-19?
Jung-Hoon, that's a very relevant question. Before we get to that, and to give our panelists time to think about their response to that, I'd like to, we've got a limited amount of time left to explore the international dimension a little bit more, because we have two questions. One from William Crawley, asking about questions of access to new treatments or vaccines. And Francis de Souza raises the broader question of the relevance of the WHO. Baroness Brinton, you mentioned, of course, the importance of coordination. Your thoughts on both those questions, but also specifically in terms of opportunities for UK-South Korea cooperation. We've seen South Korea sharing PPE with a number of countries, states in the United States, and similarly for Andrew, you rightly point out the slowness of the British response. If there had been a mechanism for closer coordination between Seoul and London in responding to the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen Jeremy Hunt, the former health minister, now the chair of the Health Parliamentary Committee, citing the case of South Korea quite a lot. Do we need a new structure for bilateral coordination that might have helped to alleviate some of that delay on the part of the British government? So let's start with Baroness Brinton, if we may.
If I can start on the issue of vaccines, and Gavi and other international collaborations are absolutely vital. And I think my great fear over the last 6 to 8 weeks has been particularly the United States deciding to go it alone, and more latterly the UK fixing its hopes on the very specific projects that it's got, although there are some international connections. But this is a global pandemic, and I think we really do need to work globally, not least because there are many countries that can't afford the investment that our countries, South Korea and others, and the UK have put into it. And we must have a vaccine that is capable of being used worldwide. And I think that's why I started globally right at the very beginning, because we all have a responsibility to everywhere on Earth, not just a social one, but this pandemic will not die out until we tackle it at a global level. On WHO, I think WHO would be the first organisation to say that it needs to constantly look at what it's doing and try to improve. I think it's very good at data collection now. And certainly if you look at what it did during, for example, the Ebola pandemic and SARS, it was very, very strong and very helpful to the affected countries. I suspect that there's a lot of politics going on there at the moment that is making this very difficult. I hope that might be resolved in one way or another. But we should always be looking at organisations that we set up as member states to collaborate, take the best and improve for the future.
Andrew.
Yeah, John, thank you. Just on that point about access to vaccines, I think one of the critical things that we need to put into the international debate now is an understanding that the prioritisation for vaccination must be related to the character of the demography of this disease. So for example, you cannot contemplate, for example, vaccinating the whole of a population in one place while the vulnerable and older population in another country are going without the vaccine. It would be an intolerable situation. In fact, the prospects are, once we have a vaccine, with the manufacturing capacity that we are likely to be able to deploy, we should be able to vaccinate the vulnerable population rapidly, and that should be the objective: is to vaccinate the vulnerable quickly. The second point about the WHO. Well, I mean, my experience with the WHO is that it is at a basic level. If you are going to have an international organisation of this kind, it should, for example, have been able to work on the issues of international travel at an early stage and create what was effectively an international framework for the management of border controls and travel regulations. That didn't happen. So I think, and frankly, is it a criticism of the management of the WHO that it didn't have it? No, it's a criticism of the willingness of the member states to vest that degree of authority in an international organisation. But actually, it would have made an enormous difference early on if there had been some decisive action on an international level to control international travel. The final thing, Representative Cho asked an interesting question: when is it all over? Well, truth is, I think only when we have a successful vaccination program. We are all, we're all saying, well, how well we've done or how badly we've done. In truth, if we have done well in these early stages, that we are left with a population where the number of those who have been exposed to the virus might be down at 10%. Therefore, we have 90% as yet unprotected. And amongst the most vulnerable population, it could be those who have successfully shielded. They haven't been exposed, hopefully, haven't been exposed at all. So the risks remain and may remain for months, many months yet. There are therapeutic options, but frankly, not the therapeutic options that will deal with the onset of the disease and prevent people becoming seriously ill. If they are helping at all, they are helping with those who are already seriously ill. So what we're really looking for to get us out of the crisis mode is for there to be a vaccination program successfully launched.
Thank you, Andrew. We're almost out of time, but I do want to squeeze in one more question. Malini Mehra asks our Korean participants specifically the relevance of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction of 2015. To what extent did that framework provide any basis for the South Korean response? And also, we've heard from Donald Trump just a few weeks ago that the G7 should be expanded to include South Korea. The G7 framework, does that provide a basis for thinking about closer coordination when it comes to the current crisis? Perhaps Representative Kim, would you like to start with that question?
예, 저희들이 이제 국제 공조를 하는 데 있어서 특히나
Well, international coordination is, I guess, easier naturally and more important if the countries are closer. That's sort of a natural coordination. Especially in Korea, China is a close and huge neighbor. And so Koreans, and there's a huge amount of trade. Chinese trade accounts for 30% plus of Korean economy. So there was a huge concern. Japan is our other close neighbor. And then there's Southeast Asia. So there is the regional coordination and cooperation, which will be a critical key in solving many future problems. And so when it comes to Northeast Asia, but also North Korea, which we didn't have time to touch upon, these are, I think, all very important homework left for us to deal with. President Trump did mention of inviting us to the G7. Korea is always ready to play our role as a responsible member of international society. And that is something that we are ready to step up to. You've also mentioned the possibility of closer or new channels of cooperation with Korea and UK, which I think is, yes, a topic well deserving our attention.
Let me make a brief comment following up what's mentioned by my colleague MP, Young-Pik Kim. So one of the characteristics of the Korean quarantine system is that since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Korea has never locked down its borders or conducted a kind of the border control. So as I've mentioned before, Korea is very closely located to China, but Korea didn't ban any the entrance coming from China. So I'm very proud of what the Korean government has done in terms of not using lockdown, the official lockdown. And also, Korea is willing to work on global collaboration with the countries around the world. And by doing so, Korea would like to make a contribution to the overcoming of the current pandemic of COVID-19 and the future potential pandemics. Thank you very much.
And if I can ask you just one final question, Representative Cho, in terms of your own question about the point of closure for the current pandemic, do you have your own timeline in mind?
Well, personally, this is my thoughts. I don't think we shouldn't expect to go back to pre-COVID-19. We would never be able to go back. We will probably have to accept this as a new normal. We wouldn't be able to go back. We just have to go forward, dealing with the health threats, but also going on and carrying on with our economic activities as normal. So it's and I think politically, it would be very of a very risky thing for a certain country to declare that their COVID is over and everybody should go back to normal. I think there's a lot of maneuvering and political sensing going on. So maybe WHO or some international organization could define, saying that if there's a certain percentage of cases maintained for a certain period, the society should go back to normal economic activity. Maybe this is a topic worth talking about. OECD, if some international organization or forum sets that standard and also defines the processes of managing that transition, if we don't do that, we may starve to death before we actually overcome the situation.
Cautionary words indeed. Baroness Brinton, can I give you the last word, if I may, and ask you to answer that same question? When are we going to be out of the current predicament?
I think I would very much agree with the last speaker. I think we cannot predict at all when it's going to happen. Worrying news yesterday in the UK about how long immunity will last. We absolutely have to have a vaccine, but we can't just sit where we are forever. We have to find a new way of moving forward. It will not look and feel like the past, but I have absolutely no doubt that the world will adapt and learn and move forward.
Thank you very much. We are over time, as I mentioned earlier. I'm afraid we're going to therefore have to wrap things up without having got to all of our questions, but with apologies to those who didn't have their question raised. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. It underlines the importance of further dialogue between our two countries, and especially, I think, the benefits of bringing informed parliamentarians together. So I want to thank Yoshi J for facilitating this on the South Korean side. I want to particularly thank our British parliamentary colleagues for taking time to be with us and to bring other of their own colleagues into this process. We would very much like to build on this, both through future webinars and future research and collaboration, as I'm sure we will have the chance. But that brings me to the end, and wish you all a very healthy future and to stay well. And thank you again for all of your comments and observations. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you to all of our colleagues too. It's been fascinating to hear what you've had to say. I hope this is the start of a continuing conversation. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. 고맙습니다.